Whenever I listen back to something that I do, it just makes me feel weird.
Hi, my lovely.
Hi.
Welcome to America's Got Talent.
Panel of judges, and eventually an entire world collectively holds its breath and asks the same question. Where did this come from? The night Courtney Hadwin walked onto the America's Got Talent stage in 2018 was one of those moments. She was 13 years old, barely 5 feet tall, wearing a fedora that looked like it belonged to someone 3 times her age. Nobody in that arena was ready for what was about to happen. And when it did happen, nothing about the world of talent television was quite the same again. But here's the thing about stories that begin with breathtaking triumph. They rarely stay there. Behind the standing ovations, behind the 10 million YouTube views that piled up overnight, behind the headlines that called her the teenage Janis Joplin, there was a real girl. A girl from a tiny English village who carried the weight of enormous expectation on shoulders that had not yet finished growing. A girl who would experience not only the highest peak of her young life, but also a sudden, frightening crash that threatened to take everything she had worked for away from her in a single rainy moment on an American highway. This is the full story of Courtney Hadwin. Not just the audition clip, not just the glory, all of it. Heselden is the kind of place most people drive through without stopping. It sits quietly in County Durham, in the northeast of England, a small community where everyone tends to know everyone else, where the weekends are slow and the ambitions of its residents are usually modest and sensible. Courtney Hadwin was born there on the 6th of May, 2004, to Paul and Marie Hadwin, 2 working parents who had no way of knowing that the child they were raising would one day reduce a packed American arena to stunned silence. Music found Courtney before she could properly articulate what music even was. Her mother had a habit of filling the house with sound, playing artists who understood how to reach inside a listener and rearrange something. Soul music, classic R&B, the kind of recordings that demand something from the room they enter. Little Courtney absorbed it the way children absorb language, not by studying it, but by living inside it. By the time she was 3, she was not just listening. She was responding, raising her hands in the air and moving her small body to rhythms that her feet already seemed to understand. By age 8, her school had noticed. A music teacher recognized something unusual in her voice, a depth and a rawness that did not belong to a child that young, and pointed her toward the school choir. Those weekly rehearsals gave structure to what had previously been pure instinct. She learned to breathe properly, to support a note rather than just release it, to understand that singing is not simply about volume, but about the space between sounds. Her classmates noticed too. They started calling her Rocker Girl, which, coming from a group of 8- and 9-year-olds, was perhaps the most honest music review she would ever receive. At 10, she organized a group of neighborhood children into something they called Durham Soul. Their parents bought instruments. Small crowds gathered on weekends to watch them. A local newspaper journalist wrote a short article about this extraordinary young girl bringing genuine soul music to County Durham. Her parents kept that article. Her mother framed it. It was the first piece of evidence that the world outside Heselden might one day pay attention. She also found her way to Schottenhall Theater School, where her vocal training became more deliberate and technical. She worked on phrasing, on emotional delivery, on the difference between singing a lyric and meaning it. Her mother drove her every weekend without complaint. These were not the actions of a stage parent pushing a reluctant child. This was a family quietly and consistently supporting someone who already knew what she wanted and simply needed the right people to help her get there. By 12, Courtney was writing things down in notebooks late at night. Goals, ambitions, the name of stages she wanted to stand on someday. She was saving her pocket money. She understood, in the way that unusually self-aware children sometimes do, that her voice was something worth investing in. The summer of 2018 brought Courtney Hadwin to Omaha, Nebraska, for America's Got Talent auditions, carrying a suitcase, a leather jacket, and the specific, focused energy of someone who has been preparing for a moment without knowing exactly when it will arrive. Backstage at the CenturyLink Center, she waited. Around her, other hopefuls stretched, warmed up, and rehearsed lines they would say to the cameras. Courtney held her fedora and her audition form and said very little. When her name was called, She followed the producers through a narrow corridor and stepped out into the light. She stood center stage before Simon Cowell, Heidi Klum, Howie Mandel, and Mel B. The audience studied her, this slight, unassuming teenager in a black leather jacket and dark jeans. She looked, in the most honest sense, like a child. Nothing about her appearance prepared anyone for what her voice was about to do. The opening bars of Piece of My Heart began, and then Courtney Hadwin opened her mouth. What came out was not the polished, controlled sound of a child who had been trained to sound impressive. It was something far more unnerving. It was raw. It was aching. It carried the kind of weight that usually takes decades of living to accumulate. She stomped her foot. She moved her body with the instinct of someone who had been performing this music in a different lifetime, and her voice cracked and soared with a freedom that made the hair stand up on the back of every neck in that building. Simon Cowell leaned forward. Heidi Klum sat up straight. Howie Mandel covered his mouth. Mel B tapped her fingers on the table, watching with the expression of someone who cannot quite believe what they are witnessing. When the song ended, the arena erupted. All four judges rose from their seats. Simon P.R. essayed his golden buzzer, sending a waterfall of gold confetti down over a 13-year-old girl from Heselden who had just, in the space of a few minutes, introduced herself to the world. Her mother was weeping backstage. Courtney, standing in the golden rain of confetti, tilted her fedora and smiled the smile of someone who had known, somewhere deep down, that this was always going to happen. The clip went online. By the following morning, it had 10 million views. By the end of the week, those numbers had multiplied. News organizations from the New York Times to the BBC wrote about her. Radio stations played the clip in place of their usual programming. Fans in countries she had never visited sent messages in languages she could not read, but whose emotional content was unmistakable. One simply said, "Your voice makes me feel alive." What followed was the life of someone who becomes, without warning, a global phenomenon before they are old enough to have a driving license. Courtney moved through the subsequent weeks of America's Got Talent live shows with a discipline and focus that impressed everyone around her. She woke early each morning to practice. She worked with her vocal coach on timing and breath control. She attended online classes to keep pace with her schoolwork. She called home every evening. She performed Janis Joplin's Maybe on the live show stage, framed by glowing arches and dramatic lighting, and the crowd rose to its feet before she had even finished the first verse. She appeared on the Ellen DeGeneres Show, where she admitted she missed her dog back home and that the sound of applause made her feel full in a way she struggled to describe. She appeared on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, where Questlove laid down a live drumbeat behind her and the whole studio became a joyful, spontaneous concert. Record labels circled. Merchandise companies made inquiries. Courtney said thank you, fielded every offer carefully with her family's guidance, and kept her focus on the music rather than the machinery of fame. She had her mother's voice in her head, steady and clear. Sing to share joy, not for fame. And yet the pressure was real. She was 13. She was thousands of miles from home. She was carrying the expectations of millions of strangers. She was managing all of this while still technically being in school. Every appearance added new weight to the crown that overnight success had placed on her head. And no one, not her family, not her management, not the judges who had cheered for her, could fully shield her from the sheer strangeness and enormity of what her life had become. She journaled. She wrote down small, quiet observations. Today I sang for millions. Tomorrow I will sing because I love it. It was a way of keeping herself tethered to the reason she had started in the first place. In early October of 2018, Courtney joined a touring group of America's Got Talent finalists, moving by bus between venues across the Midwest. It was the kind of grinding, exhausting schedule that professional musicians endure routinely, and Courtney was learning what that world felt like. Sitting near the window of the tour bus with her phone in her hand, reading fan messages while the dark landscape moved past outside. The night of the accident, rain had been falling heavily for hours. The bus was moving along Interstate 94 somewhere between Minneapolis and Madison, Wisconsin, when a gust of wind caught the vehicle on a curve and pushed it toward the guardrail. The driver braked hard, but the surface was slick and offered little grip. The bus skidded sideways for nearly 20 feet before coming to rest against the barrier with a force that threw passengers forward and sent luggage crashing down from overhead racks. Courtney's head struck a luggage rack. Her right knee took a sharp blow. When the movement stopped and the terrible sounds of metal and impact fell away into silence, she unfastened her seatbelt and stood carefully, assessing herself in the way that people who are in shock sometimes do with unusual calm. Blood ran down her temple. Her knee throbbed with a pain that told her immediately something was wrong. Others were hurt. The tour's keyboardist had injured his wrist. The manager had taken a blow to the shoulder. Outside, motorists stopped to help. Emergency services arrived within minutes. Ambulances, a fire truck, a highway patrol vehicle. Paramedics worked through the bus methodically, and when they reached Courtney and examined her knee, they confirmed what her body had already been telling her: a fracture. She was taken by ambulance to St. Mary's Hospital in Madison, where scans confirmed a fractured right kneecap and a mild concussion. No surgery was required, but she was looking at 6 weeks of severely restricted movement and a program of physical therapy. The concussion meant limiting screen time, limiting reading, limiting almost everything that had filled her days since the talent show began. News of the crash spread online within hours. A fan-created page began collecting get-well messages. Fellow contestants posted videos. Judges Simon Cowell and Heidi Klum recorded short clips wishing her well. A GoFundMe page that appeared almost immediately raised over $30,000 in less than 2 days for travel and therapy costs. Tour dates were canceled. Refunds were processed. The bus company released a statement. And in a hospital room in Madison, Wisconsin, a 13-year-old girl who had spent the last several months living inside a dream found herself lying still, in pain, far from home, wondering what came next. 2 days later, under medical supervision, she flew back to England. The front door of the family home in Heselden opened, and Courtney moved through it on crutches, a brace strapped around her right knee, carrying everything that had happened to her in the last several months like a physical weight. Her mother's cooking was in the air. Her father's familiar sounds came from the next room. She was home. Physical therapy began the following week at a clinic near Heselden. Our therapist, was patient and methodical, building Courtney back from the most basic movements, bending the knee by degrees, balancing on one leg for seconds at a time, side steps with a resistance band, light lunges. Each improvement was small and hard-won and mattered enormously. When she managed 30 consecutive minutes of exercise without pain, she and her therapist marked it together like the victory it was. The concussion guidelines kept her away from screens for long stretches, so she filled the quiet hours differently. She wrote. Lyrics emerged from those slow, still days that she would not have written in the middle of a tour. Songs about facing fear and discovering unexpected reserves of strength. Songs that compared the sound of rain on a window to a rhythm waiting to be heard. The injury had stopped her, but it had not silenced her. It had simply redirected her somewhere inward, somewhere that turned out to be worth visiting. Neighbors brought food. Friends arrived with homemade cards. One evening, a small group of local singers gathered outside and performed an impromptu concert on the driveway, their voices rising up to where Courtney watched from the porch, her crutches leaning against the wall beside her. She cried, not from sadness, but from the kind of gratitude that has no other adequate expression. By late November, she was cleared for careful vocal work. She stood in the small garden shed studio her family had set up for her, took a breath, and sang her first scales since the accident. The voice was there, intact, waiting. She recorded a practice session and uploaded it quietly, and the response from fans told her what she had barely dared to hope. They heard something new in it, a depth the crash had, somehow, added. In December, she accepted an invitation to perform at a charity benefit in Newcastle, raising funds for young musicians facing injuries or hardship. She wore a green dress. The knee brace was hidden beneath the hem. She walked onto that stage and opened with a ballad she had written herself during her recovery, building it verse by verse until she lifted her voice into a finish that brought the room to its feet. Walking off stage that night, she understood something she had not fully understood before. What she had been through was not the end of her story. It was part of it. The early months of 2019 brought Courtney back to the stage with a purpose that felt changed, sharpened by everything she had survived. America's Got Talent invited her to participate in a benefit tour, Stars for Hope, supporting young performers facing hardship. She performed at Chicago's Rosemont Theater, and the audience rose before the first chorus ended, as if they too understood that this return mattered. In London, she joined an event called Girls of Soul at the Jazz Cafe, performing alongside other female artists celebrating the history of soul music. She sang a closing number with a power that earned a standing ovation and left fellow performers gathered backstage, sharing stories with the kind of openness that only musicians who have truly seen something in each other's work seem to share. In spring of 2019, she entered a studio in Newcastle and recorded an extended play. She co-wrote 2 original songs, one about the nature of fear and how to walk through it anyway, one about the particular texture of genuine gratitude. She also recorded covers of Aretha Franklin and Etta James, and producers noted how naturally she moved between honoring those voices and remaining unmistakably herself. The EP went to Spotify and Apple Music and gathered good reviews from blogs and radio stations that were paying attention. But perhaps the most quietly significant thing Courtney did in the period after her recovery had nothing to do with her own performance career. She came home to County Durham and walked into a small theater where 50 young singers had gathered for a masterclass she was leading. She taught them about microphone technique and breath support and the specific courage required to stand in front of people and open your mouth. She told them that their voice was their story and that they should sing it true. Afterward, they lined up for photographs and autographs, clutching notebooks full of the things she had said, and she stood there and signed and smiled and understood that this, too, was what she had come to do. She established a small scholarship fund in her hometown in partnership with her first vocal coach, 2 grants per year, covering 6 months of singing lessons each. Applicants wrote short essays about what music meant to them. The first recipients were a pair of sisters, aged 10 and 12. At their first recital, they dedicated their performance to Courtney, who sat in the front row and let the tears come without apology. It would be easy to frame Courtney Hadwin's story as a simple art-talented girl from small town finds enormous stage, triumphs spectacularly, suffers setback, recovers bravely. That version is technically accurate, but it misses the thing that makes the story genuinely worth telling. The real story is about what she chose to do with everything that happened to her. The fame could have reshaped her into someone different, someone who mistook the applause for the point. The accident could have broken her, or at minimum installed a permanent fear in the place where confidence had been. Neither of those things happened, and they did not happen because Courtney Hadwin had been built on something sturdier than ambition. She had been built on a genuine and uncomplicated love of music, the kind that formed before she had words for it. In a small house in a small village where her mother played soul records and a 3-year-old lifted her hands in the air and started to move. When the crash happened and the tour stopped and the stage went dark, she went back to the thing underneath all of it. The voice, the lyrics, the garden shed with a microphone on a stand and 2 speakers on a wooden shelf. She went back to the beginning, and what she found there was enough to build forward from. The tragedy in Courtney Hadwin's story is real. A frightening accident on a dark highway, a fractured knee, a concussion, weeks of pain and forced stillness, canceled shows and disappointed fans, and the particular loneliness of being injured and far from home at 13 years old. Those things happened, and they were genuinely hard.